sourdough is probably the easiest bread in the whole world to make. It's the most ancient bread there ever has been. And if you think about it, it can't really be very hard. If you think about those sourdough gold camp crazy old geezers who managed to keep their sourdough going all through the winter and all year round, and in cabins without running water, and certainly without Cuisinarts or beautiful equipment, you got to figure it's pretty easy to work with. So it's like the quintessential natural way to have risen dough, right? So, and here's the really interesting part. You can buy starters that are supposed to be really different from all over the country, all over the world. And really what happens is after a few days in your kitchen, it's your starter. And it's going to be a reflection of what the wild yeasts and bacteria that are floating around in your home. And it doesn't take very long. I have a starter that I've had for years and nursed along, but I also, just for interest's sake, I started one on Wednesday afternoon, and I put about a half a cup of tap water and a half a cup of flour together in a bowl. And I use, this is beautiful. This is organic flour from Costco. It's super cheap. A 25-pound bag of this stuff costs $13, and it's excellent quality. And because sourdough is so simple, all it is flour, water, and a little salt. That's it. You have to use excellent ingredients. So if your tap water tastes gross, then maybe you might want to use bottled water, or filtered water. If your flour, I don't use just regular old flour. I use really good flour from a high quality mill, because that is going to be reflected very strongly in the flavor, and it will affect the flavor of your bread more than you might think. But so, okay, I started that starter on Wednesday afternoon. I put the water and the flour together and stirred it around. And when you stir starter, you want to be vigorous, because you're trying to incorporate as much air as possible, because that's what helps the bacteria and yeast grow. So on Wednesday, this was just a bowl of flour and water. I've added to it several times, and you can see, I hope, that it is bubbly and starting to be a little bit stringy even, right? So it's turning into really lively starter, and that's just in a couple days. See how gloopy that is? Yeah. So it's interesting, because if you just mix flour and water together, what you have is library, but it's the kind of paste that you make for your children to play with, right? But if you let it sit and ferment, it starts to get lively, and it grows up and starts becoming its own entity. And this starter could be used today or tomorrow, and it would be strong enough and good enough to make you have give you a whole loaf of bread. So here's my big starter bowl. And this starter has been around for a lot longer, and you can see all the big bubbles in that, I hope. And how, again, I'm using this paddle kind of spatula to get lots of air in here, because that's what makes it lively. And this starter lives pretty much on my counter most of the time, and I feed it several times a day, water and flour, in relatively equal amounts. But truthfully, I don't really measure it very carefully, because after a while you get a sense of what's good and what isn't. If it's too thin, add a little flour. If it's really thick and it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, add a little water and give it some air. And after a while, you'll get a sense of what's keeping a starter lively. Now, the thing about sourdough that's really, really important is that you can't actually use a recipe. You have to use a mixture of instinct and observation. Yeast dough, when you're using baking with baking yeast, then you do want to use a recipe. And then I time it absolutely, so that I start my yeast breads. They have a basic period of the dough being wet, and then the yeast gets added, and it's 15 minutes from the time the yeast is added and softened in the wet dough. And then the timer goes off, and I mix in more flour, and then it gets to rise for 30 minutes. And that's all, because over rising is what gives you a flat loaf. And after 30 minutes, I'll take it out and shape it and put it in a pan and let it rise another 30 minutes. The timer goes off. And then I'll bake it off for 40 minutes at 350, put in a instant read thermometer. It will say 185 degrees, boom, it's done. When bread reaches 180 or over, it's done. And so with yeast, you can be very, very recipe oriented and follow the rules or the directions. But with sourdough, you can't, because it's alive in a different way. It's more like a cat that way, right? It's going to do what it's going to do. You think of it as the culinary cat in your kitchen. So when I take yeast dough and let it rise, here's some that I started a little earlier, and you can see, I hope, that it's doubled. It's nice and airy and puffy kind of there, right? And so with this, I could now take it and shape it and make it into a loaf and let it rise up, and it would look, here, let me get one, hang on. It would look like this.
And
yeah,
this is Kimi, does temperature play any part in how much the dough will rise?
It sure does. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so that is not quite risen to the point where I'm going to bake it off, because I want it to be even with the top of the loaf pan before I put it in the oven. And I'll put the oven at 400. Put this in, and you'll get what's called oven spring, and it will get an extra rise from being in the oven at 400. And then after 10 or 15 minutes, I'll turn it to 350 and let it bake off for the rest of the time. When it's rising, because temperatures shift so much in a house from morning till night, from a foggy, wet day, hot, sunny day, I always rise bread in the oven with the oven light on. It's super easy. The oven light will heat the oven to somewhere between 80 and 85 degrees, usually, unless you have some halogen light in there, which most people don't. And that's like a perfect rising environment. So when the dough is rising, it goes in the oven with just the light on. I take it out and shape it, put it back in the pan with just the light on. When it's risen to the top of the pan, but not crusting, I'll take it out, put the oven on, and when it comes up to temperature, and again, I like to start it at about 400 to give it a little boost, put it in, and then let it have a few minutes, and you'll see this oven spring will give you that additional rise that pushes it over the top. So for instance, this little loaf was put in when it was just crusting, and you can hopefully see how much oven rise it got, quite a little bit there. And that will give you a loaf with a beautiful texture. It'll be airy and light, but nice fine grain and a beautiful tang. If you want it more sour, there's quite a few ways to do that. But one of the best ways to do that is to use a different kind of flour.
And before you go on,
yeah,
there are a couple of questions.
Good.
So, yeah, one of them, well, we have one from Reed, and he says, would you go through that one more time slowly? You do speak quickly, and some of us are trying to write. And then do you add flour and water to the starter?
Oh, sure.
And immediately start rising? And I had that question too. And the other thing Sheila asks is, when do you put the salt in?
Okay, let me take the starter one over again. So I put in a bowl, and I use glass because sometimes metals have a weird reaction with sourdoughs. The fermentation process can be kind of thrown off by that. So stoneware or glass is a better container for starter. And I just put in some water, and you could do a half a cup of water and a half a cup of flour, or a whole cup of water and a whole cup of flour, doesn't matter. And stir it vigorously, like I showed you, to get lots of air in there. Let it sit. I feed starter pretty often. So I started that Wednesday afternoon. I certainly fed it Wednesday evening before I went to bed. I fed it Thursday morning when I got up, and probably once or twice in the day, I think once or twice in the day as I thought of it, walked by. And then again this morning, I fed it again. So now I have quite a bit more than I started with, about, looks like 2.5 cups in there. You can feed starter more or less. I like, because I'm home I feed it more often, and I feed it probably 3 to 4 times a day on average. But if you only feed it in the morning and at night, that's okay too. It will give you a little more tang than you would get, it, and and your rise will be a little bit slower than it would if you're feeding it more frequently, because frequent feeding keeps it really, really lively. And
So
the starter,
when you say feed it, you're feeding the yeast,
nope, I'm here. My starter is flour and water, period.
right?
Right? When I feed it, I might give it a quarter cup of flour and a quarter cup of water.
Oh, I see. You're just adding more of those
That's
ingredients.
all it is. And then
Okay.
maybe say 5 or 6 hours later, I look at it, the bubbles are smaller and not as big. I'll put in a quarter cup of flour and a quarter cup of water and vigorously stir that in. At night, I probably give it a little more flour, because of course, as soon as what makes sourdough rise is the process of the yeast beasties eating the sugars, basically, that are in flour, the carbs, right? And when they've exhausted that or eaten all they can break down easily, that you lose rise. It goes flat. And so um, you want to catch it on the rise and keep it lively. And if it isn't lively, then you want to feed it up 3 or 4 times a few hours apart before you use it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like an art.
Well, it's more intuitive. To me, it's like plants. You have to pay attention and look at them. You can't just water them every 4 hours on schedule. You have to say, wow, it's been really hot. That one looks kind of dry, but that one looks fine. And stick your finger in the dirt and feel the leaf and all those things. And it's the same kind of, it's alive. So you have to look at it as a living creature. Uh, it doesn't necessarily have a name or a personality, but it is certainly a living creature in your care. The good news is it's incredibly resilient and extremely flexible. And if you killed it, oh no, you're out some water and flour. Bummer. Worst case, it would get moldy or something, and you would throw that away. I never throw away starter. I know a lot of recipes say you build up your starter and then throw it all away and use a teaspoon or something. And you're like, why would you do that? I use a lot of starter in my breads. I probably use 2 to 3 cups of lively starter to make a loaf of bread, and then work flour into that. And that is when I would put the salt in, Sheila. So after it's risen, so this, when I take the soupy wet stuff and I ladle in 3 or 4 cups full, whatever it is, 2 or 3, depending on the size of the loaf I want to make or how many loaves I want to make. And then I put in a teaspoon or two, a teaspoon and a half of salt per loaf that I plan to make, right? So if I'm making 2 loaves, I'll probably put 3 teaspoons of salt. Too much salt can retard the yeast, so you don't want to put in a whole ton of it. Too little, and it tastes very flat. Uh, Everything needs just a little salt to bring up the biggest flavor. And again, I use sea salt. I use a beautiful, I used to use sea salt exclusively. Now I found that a lot of the sea salts, it turns out, have plastic in them because there's so much plastic in the ocean. If you want to be sure you don't have plastic, you can go to kosher salt, which is mined from deep mines. And some people say it's over processed, but really it isn't. It's like, it's pretty pure. And that doesn't have any plastic in it. I don't know if there's really enough flavor to the little minerals and things that are in sea salt to make a big difference. But I always just liked it because it seemed more natural. But really, salt is salt, so it doesn't make that much difference. When you add, so you've got your soupy starter, and you're putting more flour into it, and that's when you add the salt. And this is also the time you might decide you want to change up the flavor. And if you wanted it to be more sour, you might start using some rye flour. If you just want it medium flour but kind of hearty, you might put in whole wheat flour. What you don't want to put in is pastry flour or cake flour, because those are both very low in gluten, and you need the gluten to give the structure and form to the sourdough. If you like that really wonderful sort of spongy, chewy texture that a lot of artisan and very expensive sourdough breads have, you can add extra gluten in the form of gluten flour, which is this. And it looks just like flour, but it's silky, very, very fine and puffy and airy. And it is very high gluten flour. Most bread flour is going to run 13 to 20% gluten, and you want to have at least that much. The gluten flour is really high, much higher than that. And so by adding 2 or 3 tablespoons per loaf of gluten flour to your flour mixture, you'll get a much silkier, kind of wonderful, chewy loaf. It actually helps with something like rye, because rye has very low gluten and it can't be handled very much. If you handle rye, sourdough, or any kind of rye bread dough, if you handle it very much and overwork it, it will be flat. So it's sort of a fragile loaf. But when you are getting ready to bake off, you kind of look or to put together your loaf. I mean, that's when you make your decision about the kinds of flour you want to use. Even spelt or some of the flourless mixtures that are, wheatless mixtures that are available now, you gluten-free, you can make sourdough bread with that. It will not taste the same and it will not have the same kind of rise. And of course, you don't want to add gluten to it because he's trying to make a gluten-free loaf. It doesn't make any sense to do that. But just be aware that it will be heavier and it will need a much longer rise. And that's the kind of, those gluten-free sourdoughs, you start them the same way with a little of the gluten-free flour and a little water and lots of air. And a few hours later, you pump them up again. And then when you make your dough, you can put it in the refrigerator and let it rise overnight. And a long, slow rise will get you a much better end result with a gluten-free loaf. Does that make sense?
Someone asked about starter isn't refrigerated.
Starter is refrigerated if you're not going to use it. I always have a bowl on my counter almost always have a bowl on the counter that just keeps going. And I might take a little off in the morning and make sourdough pancakes or waffles, or I might take some off in the late afternoon and make garlic herb rolls out of some of it. Or I might decide we need some bread and make a loaf of bread or make cinnamon rolls or whatever it is. So it's always there perking along. But I do, for insurance, always keep a jar in the fridge. And I use this kind of jar, about half full of a starter. I feed the starter, wait about an hour so I know it's very lively, and put that, maybe 2 cups of it, in a jar. And you want it closed, but not super tight, because of course it's off gassing and you don't want to blow the lid off. Makes it nice. But it can be in the refrigerator for quite a long time, and it will often get a little cloudy liquid on top, or sort of yellowy brown liquid. You can pour that off, or you can stir it in. It doesn't really make much difference. But when you wake it up again, you'll use a spatula and clean that starter out into a bowl, add flour and water, and get it going again. And I do like to keep some in the fridge as backup, because like anybody, I've been known to bake it all off and then suddenly go, oh, oops, I used all my starter. But I've always got a little bit of backup in the fridge. Generally, if you're going to refrigerate it, it's really a good idea to take it out every week or so, wake it up, give it a little flour and water and oxygen, and let it work it pretty good, and give it at least an hour or 2 in the open air at room temperature before you take some and put it back in the fridge. Does that make sense?
Sheila has a question. What is the amount of flour you use, I guess?
The amount of flour depends entirely on the weather, the kind of flour, whether you like working with a wet dough or a dry dough. The more flour you use, the longer it's going to take it to rise. A very dry dough needs a long, slow rise, and will often be a little on the drier side. So you can't, it's not a recipe.
So ultimately, the ratio of starter to flour is unknown, except you just watch and you look at it and you feel it and you slap it around.
You get a sense of it. And the way you learn is by making a lot of loaves. And some of them will probably be door stoppers. That's okay.
What would
You win
you
some, you lose some. All you're out is some flour and water. It's not an expensive disaster. It's not
like?
like you're working with champagne and lobster here. Um, and you'll get a sense of it. But I think part of it is getting past the recipes. It's so confusing. If you go online, you'll find 40 different, completely different theories, and they're all absolutely right. That's not the way it works. It's really conditional, and it works how it works in your kitchen with your time schedule. That's the way it works, right? And you'll find though, after a while, you'll start getting a sense of like, oh, that one just kept, it fell. If you get really uh, bread that looks good and then it falls, you missed the rise. You waited a little too long. And uh, generally, for me in my kitchen and in my oven with the oven light on, I'll take some starter and mix the flour in, let it do one rise like that. On the second rise, I will mix in the salt and some gluten flour probably, and maybe that's when I add garlic powder or um, rosemary or lemon peel and whatever it is, and then let that rise again. And that's probably about 2.5 hours for each rise. So I might start in the morning and look in mid-morning and say, oh yeah, there it goes. Add something, put it back in the oven to do its slow rise again. And when I'm ready to form the loaf, I will take it out and see if it needs more flour or not. Sometimes it does not. One thing that's the coolest thing you'll ever buy is this little weird rubber paddle thing. This is great for scraping the dough. And if you're working with kind of a wet dough, you can scrape and fold the dough instead of trying to use your hands to do the kneading. And because I have a lot of arthritis in my hands and wrists, I find I'm using this more and I'm using this less. Because this is really easier on your hands. It also makes cleaning the bowl really a breeze, which is kind of nice too. And it's a very inexpensive tool, but it's really, if you watch a lot of videos, you'll see a lot of chefs, bakers are using one of these to shape their loaves too. I've completely lost track of where I was. What do you need?
So, and you're saying that you're having a minimum of 3 rises from, right? And
Almost always. Now, the one time that I wouldn't is like I would take some starter and dump it in a bowl and add some flour. And if I know that I'm gonna mix that into kind of a loaf, if I'm gonna make rolls and it's gonna be pretty quick, I'll go ahead and add the salt and possibly some gluten flour. And that's when I would probably put in a little bit of garlic powder. This is granulated garlic. You might use that. You might use roasted garlic powder, teaspoon to start with per loaf, and then see how much you like. Some people use 2 or 3 teaspoons or a tablespoon. If you get too much garlic in, like salt, it can retard the rise. So you don't want too much. One of my favorites is this, which is basil salt. So you take a whole bunch of basil from your garden and put it in the quiz with salt and grind it up. And then you spread it on a baking sheet, a rimmed baking sheet, and in a single layer, and bake it at 225 until it crisps up, about 25 to 30 minutes. You hit it with a spatula, it will crack in sheets. Then you put it back in the quiz and grind it up again, and it will keep for years, and it smells incredible, and it tastes amazing. And you can use the basil salt in bread, or you can use it on the rolls. So for that, instead of the third rise, I would just take it and put it on the rimmed baking sheet again with a little flour and roll it into a snake and pat the snake out flat, rub some butter across it or oil if you'd prefer, and then sprinkle on, again, some garlic, some basil powder, salt and pepper, Parmesan cheese, pesto, whatever seems delicious. Roll it up like a cinnamon roll, cut it. I usually put my snake in half and cut that, and then put each half in half and cut that, and then make 3 pieces out of it. So I get a dozen little rolls, put them in an oiled baking pan. I use a little 9x9 glass baking pan and let them rise. And they can rise for quite a long time. And they'll double or triple or even quadruple. And you bake those off really fast, 400 degrees, 20 minutes. And they're like this light, puffy, incredible, fragrant amazingness, and they're gone in minutes. Even if you're the only person in the kitchen. This happens.
So, and there are a couple of questions, and then I want to know where one can buy things from you. I guess what I'm trying to get here is, if you're a complete novice, it is clear you've made thousands of loaves.
I have.
And so what is intuitive to you because of your huge background of experience? It is a little daunting for beginners to eat. For me anyway, I'm trying to even picture myself doing this and then trying to remember the first sentence you said. But oh, luckily we have the recording. But so anyway, I have a couple of questions for you from people. Reed asks, so you said start baking at 400. Do you drop back to 350? And you did say that, but I think you would like an answer to that.
I started at 400 to get that oven spring. And then after 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll set a timer because I usually forget. In 10 minutes, if it's little rolls, I just leave it at 400 and they're going to bake in 20 minutes anyway. So there you go. If it's smaller loaves, like these little rounds, they bake pretty fast. So 10 minutes is fine at 400, and then I'll drop it. I just turn the oven off, turn it back on to 350, boom, without taking them out or anything like that. And I have an instant read thermometer, which is a fantastic tool because 180 degrees is your magic number for bread. And so if you're not really sure if the bread is done, you can just poke it with the thermometer and it will tell you very quickly where it is, and put it right into the center of the loaf. And sometimes it'll still be, oops, sorry. Let's see if I know how to do this. Reed taught me how to turn my phone off one time and I've never forgotten it.
Okay, now we're equal, huh?
Yeah. So the temperature thing is, kind of depends on your stove too, right? And how old it is or how effective it is, what you're cooking it in. I always use these glass pans because I like the control I get on these. And I like the evenness of them. Some people prefer metal. It doesn't make any difference. I found that it's not the easiest. You have to, if you want the perfect rustic loaves that are not formed in anything with sides.
No, my standards aren't that high.
Well, it's a whole different deal. You have to have a rising basket. You preheat a Dutch oven or something like that with a top. Sometimes people use those clay bakers, and those are at like 450. And then you very carefully flip this risen dough into the thing. And to me, that's like a lot of trouble. I just want to eat the bread. Like,
yes,
I don't care. So, and this comes out looking absolutely beautiful. There's no, to me, there's no downside to this. Even these little rounds are fun because when you slice them, you don't have to slice them this way. You just slice them like that, regular, and they come out like a regular piece of bread except for the two little ends. And so they're a nice little sandwich size. And I have bigger casserole dishes, round ones or square ones that I use for different things. If you wanted to make focaccia or something like that, it's all just, it depends on what shape you want, really, or how.
But the baking time would be different, right?
That's what I was just going to say. In a shallower pan, it's going to bake off faster. That's like those rolls bake off in about 20 minutes. And those I bake in just a little baking pan. They don't take very long. And again, your thermometer is going to be your best guide because a lot of recipes will tell you the timing, and the timing is only a suggestion. You have to figure it out yourself. So temperature is the real key, and temperature is the real key to rise too.
180. Is it 180?
180.
Okay.
And can I ask you something, please?
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely against what you've been saying, okay? Because, but I'm the kind of person that sort of needs some more direction. So I've got the starter going. It's bubbled and it's been happy, and I've done it 3 times and I added to it 3 times or whatever. So I have about 2 or 3 cups of starter now, or maybe a little, about that much. Anyway, how much of that starter do I put in to the with flour, and how much flour in order to do I'm probably going to do 1 loaf pan.
So take your starter, and it's probably 2 or 3 days old by now. You've been working on it for that long and adding. So, but by the 3rd day, you're going to have at least 2 or 3 cups. So feed it again, let it stand for about an hour, and then put a good 1 or a cup at least of that in the fridge in a jar like this that has a lid. And again, lid on, not on too tight. These are peanut butter jars. They're kind of perfect. And then you know your starter will not get used. Then you will take the rest of your starter, and by now maybe you have 2 cups left. Well, you might need a little. 2 cups is about 2 liquidy cups. I mean, 2 cups of water is enough to make 2 loaves of bread usually, but 2 cups of starter is not pure liquid. So that's about right for 1 loaf, 1 regular sandwich loaf like that. Is that good? And then generally speaking, the rough rule is going to be 1 cup of water, 2 to 3 cups of flour. So your 2 cups of starter is probably going to take 2 to 3 cups of flour added to that. But again, you don't. And here's the deal. When you're working the flour, mixing it up, you'll get it to the point where it's too stiff to mix with a spoon, but it's still sticky. So when you're doing the last bit by hand, wet your hands. It's like magic, and the dough will not stick to them, and you don't get caked all over the place with this sticky stuff, which is kind of gross. So wet your hands when you're doing that final shaping. I rise the final rise in the loaf pan, which I've oiled, and I use avocado oil for the oil because it is high temp. It goes up to 450 perfectly happily without scorching. And it's basically, it's not quite flavorless, but it has a kind of a very mild buttery flavor, which most people find very pleasant. Does not taste like avocados. But I use avocado oil, just like a half a teaspoon, and I rub it all over the pan and then put the loaf in. And I usually put it kind of upside down, back and forth it a couple times, and then flip it so that, because you've gathered your loaf, so it's got kind of a seal. And I hold it by that, squidge it around a little bit, flip it so that now the smooth top is there. Take your knife and slash. You can do 1 big slash. You can do several little slashes. You can see here I slashed this several times. And as the loaf expands, those slashes get bigger. And that makes part of the decorative effect. Here, this was just a simple cross. But you can see how much it spread as the dough kept rising, right? So your answer, Sheila, is going to be you don't usually buy 2 cups of flour, right? I mean, you're going to have some flour, and you're going to have to play with it a little bit to see what's the right amount. If you didn't have enough flour and it was really soupy and wet, you might not get much rise. If you had too much flour and it was really dry, you'd have to go a very long time, like the overnight in the fridge slow rise, probably, to get it to really give you a good rise. And that's the play part. That's where you have to kind of try stuff out and see what happens. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. So what you're saying essentially is, it sounds like it's 1 to 1, and you sort of play with it.
No, it's more like one. If it was like in a yeast bread, you put 2 cups of water and 4 cups of flour, gives you 2 loaves of bread, basically.
That's right. But what about with the starter?
Well, the starter is not a liquid, really. So 2 cups of starter. Oh, I see what you're saying. I usually end up using a little more than that. So you really have to kind of see. It just, like, what's a wet starter? You don't know. There's no definition. Or there are. I mean, some people will tell you it needs to be a 90% hydration of la 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 la, and it's like, yeah, or not. I don't have a hydrometer in my kitchen.
So what you're saying is you put the 2 cups of starter together with 2 to 3 cups of flour, and you work it, and let it rise. And then after it's risen, that's when you put the salt in and put some more flour in.
Okay, the first rise, I'm not going to put all the flour in that I want. I'm just going to put in maybe a cup and a half of flour, because I want that to be, that's just a hydrating the flour. If you dump a lot of, and that's why I do several rises, because if you just dump in a bunch of flour, oftentimes it won't really hydrate very well, and you'll get patches of like you'll be slicing it, and there'll be like a little bubble of flour that hasn't incorporated. So you want to make sure it has time. And plus, part of the fermentation process is that the bread flour actually gets fermented a little bit, which makes it supposedly easier to digest and certainly gives it a more piquant flavor. So that extra rise is really partly for that, to get that first digestion going. And then the second, after it's doubled, that's when I put the salt in. And that's when I might change flours too, or make it so it's half whole wheat or half spelt or half rye.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
And you don't, I usually put the flour in by the quarter cup and mix it before I add more, because you don't really know where you're going until you do that.
Oh, did you say how much salt to put in?
I usually,
For one loaf, say?
I would say 1 to 1.5 teaspoons per loaf of a standard sandwich loaf size.
And do you know of a support group of the sourdough, association of beginning sourdough bread makers?
Well, there's me. I'm happy to give
Online support as you're right in the middle of a question, or
yeah, no, I mean, I actually I met somebody at the grocery store not that long ago who was trying to buy flour, and she was saying, she sort of looked at me and said, "Is 1 cup right if I'm going to make bread?" And I was like, "Honey, no, you need to have more bread." And then we actually exchanged phone numbers, and she texted me throughout her whole process and showed me her loaf of bread, and she was thrilled. But it's like, why would we not help each other? We spend all our lives learning things. Why would we not be delighted to share that information? I'm happy to help. I like to.
Yeah, it would be dangerous to put a question up on Bainbridge Islanders. You might never get out.
Right.
But,
but here among friends, I'm good.
I like Karen's question.
yeah, the scraper. Where can you buy the scraper?
Town and Country, Rite Aid, Ace, Safeway, maybe, I don't know. It's not a high-end tool. It's just called a bread scraper. I don't even know how old this one is, but it certainly done years worth of duty, and it's still in really good shape. They come in metal as well, but I don't like the metal ones. This is flexible, so it fits the side of a round bowl really well, which to me is the whole point. And I can flip the dough, like I said, because my hands and wrists are getting a little arthritic. I use this a lot of times to do what some people call a flip technique rather than an actual kneading, because kneading, you're actually putting pretty good force on the dough. You can also just, when you have your bowl of dough, you can just punch it down a bunch of times. And I usually, because I'm just me, I like to do about 100 kneads or turns for a sandwich loaf. I don't do it at all for like the rolls, because by the time you've mashed them and rolled them out and then rolled them up again, that's good enough. You don't need to do any kind of kneading with that. But for the really light texture, I like to do quite a lot of kneading. But so I'll go punch 10 times, flip the whole thing, punch 10 times, flip the whole, entertain myself like that for quite a long time. But you don't really need to.
It's a good way to get rid of your anxiety too, isn't it?
It is. It's a self-soothing technique, right? And it smells fabulous even before you bake it. The kitchen with the rising bread in it is like deliciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's all good.
How long to bake a loaf for a loaf, did you say?
Well, it really depends. A traditional sandwich loaf usually takes about 35 to 40 minutes. And I'll check it at 35 with my instant read pin thermometer. And if it's only like 165 or 170, it's going to go fast. So probably another 5 minutes is all it will take. And sometimes I'll just turn the oven off and put it back in and let it have that last few minutes to get all the way to 180.
Well, Anne, you've done it again. You've totally expanded our minds, and filled it with wonderful information and inspired us. Raise your hand if some of you will be going to the kitchen and baking sometime in the near future. And so we'll have war stories to share.
Yeah,